Hello and welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Battery and Storage Podcast. I am your host, Bill Derasmo. With me today is Laura Pagliarulo, the president of SolaREIT. Welcome to the program, Laura.
Thanks so much, Bill. Great to be here.
Great to have you on today, Laura. Before coming to SolaREIT in 2020, you had senior positions at Clean Choice Energy and SunEdison, and you were 7 years at WGL. I would note that you have a graduate degree from one of the more popular schools among high school students where I live in Northern Virginia, and that is you have a master's degree from JMU, James Madison, over in Harrisonburg. Before that, your BS from Vermont. But why don't I give you a chance to introduce yourself and let us know how your career journey led you to SolaREIT and your current position?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so you did your homework. I haven't thought about my undergraduate in a long time. So I started out at the University of Vermont in the School of Natural Resources. And having a teenager now and sort of reflecting back on where I was at his age, I didn't know at all what I wanted to do, but I did know I was very passionate about environmental issues and in particular climate change. And then when I looked at sort of the assessment of where most greenhouse gases come from, it was either the transportation sector or the energy sector, which kind of led me into the energy space overall. So since the age of 20, and I'm quite a bit older now, I've been doing energy, renewable energy, and clean energy related projects. So yeah, you're right. I spent 7 years at Washington Gas and their deregulated division overseeing the voluntary renewable energy products there. And I really describe that as where I grew up in the energy space. After that, I went to SunEdison, and my responsibility was developing their community solar product. And that was really at a point when community solar was just extremely nascent. Not very many people knew about it, and sort of the notion of having a fungible project where residential consumers could go in and out was sort of unheard of for financing. And then after that, I spent some time at Clean Choice Energy helping build their solar energy division. And came to SolaREIT really, my background in recent years has really just been solar. I'm the founder of the business. There are four of us. And the idea was sort of surfaced by one of the other main founders providing developers with options for their real estate financing. And quite frankly, when it was originally proposed to me, I thought, wow, that's such a boring idea. After doing community solar, that sounds so dull. But of course, like so many other ideas, it started to germinate and I started to see applicability across the space. And when a lot of these very good developers were confronted with either a large purchase option or the landowner's desire for something other than a 30-year annuity payment lease, they didn't have the capital. While they could potentially raise the capital for a $400,000 land purchase, when you start talking about millions of dollars, it just became much more challenging. So launched the business 3.5 years ago.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate walking through that because I was wondering what exactly is a renewable energy real estate investment company, but I think I have a better idea. But why don't you just elaborate on that for the uninitiated? If you're not a real estate investment person or a real estate lawyer, what's the sort of business thesis for SolaREIT?
Yeah, it's a great question. So our whole team, and especially the executive team, I think collectively we just tallied it up, has over 200 years in the renewable energy industry in terms of experience. So we've been project developers, project financiers, negotiating PPAs, MIPAs, so forth. What we do now is really, as solar and battery storage is growing, I'd say 8 times out of 10, the real estate underlying the solar or the battery storage project is separate from the project itself. So we provide the financing for the underlying real estate to the project. And there are a couple key reasons for that. Land is not ITC eligible, so it's not included in the basis. Oftentimes, so that's one reason. And our cost of capital is specifically designed for the real estate underneath the projects. Second reason is when developers don't have another option for the real estate, they end up using frequently development capital to purchase the land or to prepay the lease, if you will, which is very inefficient. Development capital, as you know, tends to be more expensive, even for the well-established shops. And our cost of capital is just tied to real estate, which is an entirely different beast. So that's really what we do day in and day out. We work with developers, solar and battery storage developers across the country to help solve their real estate problems.
Very interesting. And obviously with solar, it takes a lot of acreage. If you want to build at scale, it takes a lot of land. And I know just dealing with some clients, what some of the challenges are with that. So it sounds like you guys have found a way to offer developers a solution that would give them a leg up in terms of their financing. Because as you say, development capital is expensive. And so that's on the solar piece, it takes a lot of land. But let's talk for a minute about storage, since this is the battery and storage podcast. So I'm sure as the storage sector has exploded in growth, it caught your guys' attention. So why don't you talk a little bit about SolaREIT and how you're positioning yourself for the storage sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe just a little bit of background. So our first fund that we raised 3.5 years ago was $150 million in total. And that 50 million from equity, $100 million securitization from TIA Craft Naveen. That fund was full at the end of December. And that allowed us we were only permitted to do solar as part of that fund. So the second round, this new asset co that we stood up with AB Carval, is $100 million initially, up to $250 million potential, which we, of course, will lever with debt. And this particular facility allows us to do standalone battery storage. Now, we always did solar plus storage with the first fund, but with the new asset co, we're permitted to do standalone battery storage. Some key differences, of course, is that while many solar projects can be in rural areas with low real estate prices, what we see more commonly with standalone battery storage is a location in urban areas, expensive urban areas with expensive tickets for land. And oftentimes, if you're developing a project in Manhattan or one of the boroughs or LA or, Houston, Texas, there are a lot of other options for the landowner in terms of selling their property. And typically the purchase price tends to be more expensive. So we started partnering with some of the well-experienced battery storage developers across the country to help solve their land problems, if that makes sense. And I think it's important to note that, like I said before, while someone could pass the bucket and raise money for a $500,000 purchase of land in Minnesota, it's much more difficult when you have a $14 million quarter acre of land in Manhattan or something like that. So
No, that's a great point and sort of an obvious difference in terms of the characteristics if you're doing just a solar development versus storage. The footprint for the storage facility, it can be very small, but as you say, then the challenge is if the storage is going to be located in an attractive spot from, say, the energy market perspective, say behind a constraint, well, you don't have a lot of constraints out in, the Great Plains or wherever you're going to build a 500 megawatt solar facility. But you would have typically a constrained area where you might want to put a storage installation, a BESS, battery energy storage system, for instance. So I could see that the characteristics of the challenge are going to be fundamentally different. So that's interesting that you guys stood up this second fund that allows you to do standalone battery storage. And talk about the REIT structure, because again, I think for the uninitiated in the energy space, they might be less familiar with that term and real estate investment trust, but maybe put some meat on those bones.
Yeah, I think just in general, a real estate investment trust, the reason why we initially launched our first capital pool with that structure is because it had some advantages for our investors. All projects we do right now are what we call REITable. And that means we're really focusing on the real estate underneath the project. And those real estate transactions really come in one of three flavors. And as we're talking about battery storage, I'll just focus in on these particular examples. We can either buy the land under a battery storage project that is in construction or operational. So that's the fee simple transfer. Second thing we do is, for example, let's say the developer wants to own the land. In that scenario, we can purchase an easement and take assignment of the lease and essentially advance the capital, put an easement over the project area, collect rent payments over time, but the developer or the landowner still owns the property. After the easement expires, they have fee simple ownership as they always have. And then the third option, which is priced similarly to an easement, is we just undertake it as a loan, similar to a mortgage in some ways, but quite different as well. And that product is really geared towards landowners and developers who want to own the fee simple interest, but are very tax sensitive. don't want to incur capital gains taxes and so forth. So the REIT structure doesn't really come into play when we're talking with developers. It's just more that we're very focused. And I say this because it's critical. We're the only provider in the market that is pure play. So all we do all day long is work with developers and focus on their real estate solutions, which the only reason why we've had success is because we are always accretive to their project returns.
That's an important point to make. And you were talking about, I think, your cost of capital, right? And how that gives an advantage to everything. So that's a critical point. If you're a developer and you're listening to this, and then I think then you could start the conversation maybe with that point. But again, in terms of the real estate needs and if you have a hybrid project, talk to me about those. So you'd have, obviously you need a fair amount of land, say for the solar piece, and then for the storage piece, it's a smaller footprint. But are there unique challenges associated with hybrid projects?
No, I think the hybrid projects are pretty down the runway, like any solar deal. I think that one point to note, and going back on your previous statement, cost of capital is obviously very important. But in sort of building this organization, there was just four of us for the longest time, and now there's like 25 of us. We've really made it an intentional point to hire people from the industry. And the reason I say that is because we are only focused on solar and battery storage developers. It's really important that we understand their pain points. So when someone comes to us and like we will do a number of deals in New York City, we'll do a number of deals in Houston, Texas, and then a number in California. Those are the ones that are near term on our plate. But because we've been in their shoes before, we're just taking advantage of almost confirmatory diligence. So when we're talking about cost of capital, that's one thing, but then there's all these other costs. So very minimal legal costs because we're just basically leveraging the diligence that's already been done on the project. By the time we come in at NTP or FNTP, the project's been diligenced by tax equity, sponsor equity, debt. Like we don't need to duplicate any of those efforts. Likewise, I think it's like 75% of our business, they're repeat partners. You get one in, it's rinse and repeat. So with these battery storage shops, you get one under our belt, and then I think it's kind of, most of them are using the capital right now as dev capital. But the solar plus storage is mostly, it's just very similar to solar in this way. The standalone battery storage in urban areas, that has been quite a different approach for us, which is really exciting because, I get more excited at deploying larger chunks of capital than $400,000 in St. Cloud, Minnesota. So
Yeah. And well, as a lawyer, by the way, my ears perked up on your previous point about diligence, and
oh yeah.
the project's been diligenced 3 times over. And you mentioned tax equity counsel and debt counsel, and they can be very, and should be very exacting in their diligence.
Yeah.
Sort of been on both sides of that. You can really drill into various issues from the lawyer's perspective. But what you're saying is you take advantage of the fact that you tend to hire people who have been in the trenches with these deals, understand just from years of experience, it sounds like, what the sensitivities are with a particular deal, what you can kind of breeze over quickly and say, yep, that doesn't look like it's a problem at all. So you can be more efficient in getting through a deal.
Yeah. I mean, I think the truth is, and this has been like a shift for many of us, is we're just focused on the real estate. We have no claim to the asset. So we really need to your point, having been an attorney on, the debt and the tax equity, those are long, painful processes often. One of our main promises is essentially we're very easy to work with. You don't need a person. We're basically taking the diligence that's been done. And most of the time that comes in the form of a developer just opening up a data room, and we're looking for 5 things, right? We want to know that discretionary permits are in hand. We want to know that there's interconnection, an interconnection agreement or deposit made. Not concerned when it will be COD per se. We want to see a survey and title. We want to see a phase 1, and that's it. So those are really the points that we are looking for. We don't get into the business of we want to see the PPA or the O&M agreement or the EPC. That's not something that we are concerned with. And as a result, the business is made to scale.
No, that all makes sense when you walk through it. All makes logical sense of what you would be concerned about, what you wouldn't be concerned about. For someone like me sitting in Washington, there's a lot of FERC diligence items, but it sounds like those really aren't in your sweet spot of what you're looking for the most part, other than maybe some of the interconnection issues you said. But Yeah, I mean, things like the fact whether it's going to be EWG'd or all those things. But you're at the development stage, so issues like do they have market-based rate authority don't really come up yet. So
Yeah, I mean, I think like most of our projects are not connected at the ISO. Most of them are connected at the local utility. We do want to know who the offtake is. We don't need to see the PPA. We're not concerned with the rates or anything like that. But with battery energy storage with the standalone systems, we certainly want to talk about merchant projects. Obviously, our business, the reason why our cost of capital is attractive is because we're at the top of the waterfall. People pay their leases, and having been at SunEdison when they went bankrupt, no matter what, people pay their lease payments. But we do want to have an understanding of where the revenue will come from, especially in the merchant world.
you use the term waterfall, which is a corporate-y term. And so I've become familiar with the meaning of that term through work with certain clients and not having had a corporate background. But it's just interesting that when you use the word waterfall, that sort of jumped out at me.
That's actually interesting. I need to stop using that word. Thank you.
No. I get it now. And so, in terms of, again, it's interesting because we had a lot of different types of guests on the program. We've had all different. I have a former partner who used to talk about, well, which end of the elephant are we talking about? We really hadn't focused on the real estate piece until we had you on today. And so, I just think it's an interesting point to emphasize to the audience. I mean, because it's something that we just sort of take for granted. It's like, oh, well, we've got this great technology. We can deploy it at scale. We can go out and build these projects. But then you do get into the real world challenge of actually finding a parcel of land that's available for in the first instance, like, okay, this person willing to sell, I can get this piece of land. It's big enough that I can build my project on it. It makes sense where it's located. I can get to a point of interconnection. I could sell it onto the grid. There's a lot of things that have to fall into place from a developer's point of view. And so I just think the real estate piece is something that a lot of times we breeze over and we take for granted. I know I have when we've had these conversations on different points. So I just think it was really interesting to have this conversation today and to focus on that piece. And if there's anything you want to add to what I just walked through, like what are some of the things that you've run into as either, from whichever side on just sort of the misadventures of trying to line up a parcel of land and actually build the project?
No, I think that's great. I think you make a good point. So obviously the shops we're working with right now tend to have been the early movers in the standalone battery energy storage space. And what I'm certainly seeing is those projects, because it's far more complex to site a battery storage project in an ideal location than it is for a solar project. So the most valuable projects are very site specific in many ways. What we see is as more battery storage projects come online, the less valuable they're going to be. And even though the projects are particularly could be less valuable, fast forward 5 years because there'll be more systems, on the grid. The land for those, they're going to increase. So the prices are going to increase. So just like we saw with solar, the early movers to the market could get a lease at a very attractive rate. And I sit in Massachusetts. Our company's based in DC. As time went on and they got word of other projects coming online and things like that, not only are you going to have fewer sites available, but landowners are going to become more sophisticated in terms of what they think they can get in terms of leases or sale prices. So I think the real estate component, especially for battery storage, is critical because they're big ticket items. And some other challenges I think we're seeing, I think one of the advantages of this business and where I sit is we talk to developers across the board. So we're not competing with anyone. And we have many conversations throughout the day, myself, the BD team, my CFO. And some of the things we're hearing as far as pain points go, is difficulty securing financing for some of these projects because of, what everyone's facing. There's interconnection risk. And with some of these assets, if your interconnection's delayed and you lose a summer, that has massive impacts to your returns. Other things we're seeing is, some hesitancy or reluctance to invest in projects that have more of a merchant component and not contracted revenue. That's something we're seeing. And I think across the board, how I look at the storage developers we're partnering in with is that they have a number of issues they have to solve on a daily basis. The real estate component shouldn't be one of them. It should be very simple, very smooth. And that's how we operate, and obviously accretive. So that's how we run our business.
There's some really interesting points in what you walk through there. I think for the broader audience, you're talking about, again, I don't know if the broader audience or I really thought about the real estate piece for standalone storage. And as you say, if it's going to be valuable, it's going to tend to be in a very specific location. And those specific locations, if they're associated with a constraint or behind a constraint, those tend to be more expensive areas in society in general, right? So they're not, like you say, it's not a solar facility out in the Great Plains. So that's an interesting piece. And then the piece about the delays associated with interconnection. Now you're talking my language, right? As a regulatory attorney for my day job, I mean, though we've heard that in various contexts or various iterations, that those delays on the queue and those delays in getting the interconnection arrangements finalized and agreements signed and everything else are a killer. We've talked a lot about permitting reform and all that's great, but my point has consistently been, yes, permitting reform if you can do it, but the bigger issue is fix the interconnection queue. And I don't think the people on the Hill understand that. They just think permitting reform. Okay, great. You're not drilling into what the real issue is. The real issue is the interconnection queue. And, I know FERC issued Order 2023, which is supposed to address a lot of this. And I think over time, hopefully will, but it's a long process to get that implemented. And believe me, we're working with clients on trying to do it, but it's so many things that need to be addressed in the compliance plans. And so we'll see how that plays out. But it's really interesting to hear someone who's dealing with, as my former partner said, the end of the elephant that you look at on the real estate side, that those interconnection delays are really affecting project viability.
No, they are. It's another aspect of risk that I know many developers are confronted with, in addition to solar developers. I mean, it's across the board. I think the risk of timing is really important for the battery storage developers, because you're not getting a 20-year PPA necessarily. So you lose a summer when, especially in the early years, that has massive impacts to returns. Not to say the same delays aren't impacting the solar business as well, but it's just less dramatic. In addition to the delays, also increasing interconnection costs. I mean, that's something that we're seeing across the board as well, that developers are sensitive to. I think the one thing about our business that I've always admired is that in this industry, everyone's very adaptable. You said you've been in this industry for a long time as well, but at least with solar and storage developers, I feel like it's sort of like, tell us the rules, we'll figure them out. But just tell us the rules. And that's like looking back at like the tariff issue and just so many other obstacles, but they're real problems for sure.
Well, that gets into another concept that would resonate with me and for many others is sort of regulatory certainty. And so as we now change the interconnection rules, let's not change them again right away. There is going to be a degree of uncertainty because you've got the interconnection rules implementation, and then you've got FERC positioning itself to issue a final rule on its transmission rulemaking, which I understand is not exactly the same, but it could have an impact on how these projects get developed and cited. So you've got that piece hanging out there as well, and a lot of rumors about when that rule will come out as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, and it's when we built this business, we were we spent so much time thinking about what we needed to be concerned about and what we didn't. And one thing that we're not concerned about is a lot of times when these battery storage developers are getting site control, they're competing against commercial developers, residential developers. And for the time being, the revenues for the BESS projects are strong enough to compete with those entities. We come in at FNTP, as I mentioned, but we are more or less agnostic as to when actual interconnection occurs. And the reason for that is, as long as the project continues to pay lease revenues, we're not taking risk on when COD happens. And thankfully, that's the case because we acknowledge, like, one thing that's consistent in this industry is the timing always changes. And people who come into this industry from the outside, I think it really frustrates them but that's just the nature of these projects and how things work. So, you're right. I mean, the permitting rules you're talking about, the interconnection, transmission, change is evident, but at least for the real estate component of our business, we're less concerned about that. Certainly feel the pain of the developers, but it's not something that impacts how we model pricing and so forth.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it makes sense for what part of the business you're in. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's just a lot, probably more that we could get into. I mean, the supply chain difficulties for developers have certainly impacted the timing and number of projects that have advanced. But again, you guys might be somewhat insulated from that.
I think what's interesting is we are, of course, in some ways, but what we've seen is, especially with interest rates going up and supply chain issues continuing to plague a lot of the industry and interconnection costs and all the things we've discussed, is that a lot of the developers we're working with are taking the financing from our business and using that as development capital.
Okay.
And I say that because our cost sale, I'll give you a perfect example. If, let's say, a battery storage developer has a purchase option for $1 million, and we look at the expected revenues from that project, and we know that, hey, we could actually pay $2 million for that purchase option and still be comfortably within, let's call it 10% of the projected revenue. 1 million of that goes to satisfy the landowner for the purchase option, and another million of that goes to the developer to use as dev capital. And we're seeing that as an alternative source of development capital because, we're still in the single digits and dev capital tends to be much more expensive. So anyways, that's a very simple example that we're seeing more widespread.
Really interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, why don't we wrap up? But it's been great to have you on the program. Again, it's an aspect of storage development, solar development, project development that we really tend to gloss over, at least I do. The real estate piece, the underlying land, all the challenges associated with that. And it's interesting to hear what you guys are bringing to the table. So we very much appreciate you being on the program. I learned a lot today. I'll give you the last word if there's anything else you want to put out there, and just let the audience know, developers, how they can work with you and SolaREIT.
Well, I want to say before that, Bill, I actually learned a lot in talking to you today. And, you're deeply entrenched in the permitting side of things and FERC, and that's always fascinating to me. And what a cool job to be able to talk to multiple people in different parts of the industry. I think that's probably hopefully one of the more fun things that you do to balance out your dialogue with FERC. As far as like last word goes, I would say that our team is simple to work with. It's pretty binary. If you have a purchase option or, some sort of real estate problem, we can add value without a burn on time. So, but other than that, we're definitely not a pushy bunch of people. We're more attraction rather than promotion.
I think a lot of people would like to hear attraction versus promotion. So that's good to hear. And in terms of fun, I'm not sure I would say it's fun, but, I'd probably go trail running or I don't know.
Okay, fair. Fun within the professional context. We should qualify that.
Right. Yeah, no, we're just joking. But no, it's great to have you on today. And folks, go learn more about SolaREIT. And until next time, thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.